Today I'm going to show you 3 methods for knitting a provisional cast on. A provisional cast on is basically a temporary holder for stitches, and it allows you to work in one direction of knitting and then remove the cast on, and you typically work in the opposite direction from there. Provisional cast ons are commonly used for folded hems, or, for knitting a top-down seamless sweater, for example. If you can imagine this being the shoulder seam of a sweater, where you knit the front of the sweater first, and then at the end you come back and remove the provisional cast on so that you have live stitches on your needle and you can begin working in the opposite direction. So if you've done the front of the sweater, maybe you're undoing the provisional cast on and you're working in the opposite direction for the back of a sweater. That's just an example of when you might use a provisional cast on. But today we're going to go through 3 methods. The first method is going to be just using knitting needles. So I find that that's handy sometimes if you don't have a crochet hook to make a provisional cast on. And the other 2 methods require a crochet hook. I have a crochet hook that's about the same size as my knitting needle, and today we're using some pink yarn as the project yarn and some gray yarn as the waste yarn. Let's get started. In this method of a provisional cast on, let's say I don't have a crochet hook and all I've got are my knitting needles. I'm going to take both the project yarn and the waste yarn and hold them together. Leave enough space so that you can use the tail end as your part of your cast on. This cast on is exactly like a long tail cast on. So if you're familiar with a long tail cast on, you'll be very familiar with this type of provisional cast on. I'm going to make a slip knot. Again, holding both of the waste yarn and the project yarn together. Make a slip knot. And you'll take the tail end of the waste yarn, hold it to the left, and the working end of the project yarn, and hold that to the right. So the tail end of the waste yarn over here on the left, the working end of the project yarn on the right, and just like a long tail cast on, you'll hold the yarn like this. All right, so just like a long tail cast on, you're going to grab the first strand of the waste yarn through that loop that's over your thumb, rotate a little bit and bring the needle down through the loop by the index finger, and bring that project yarn through the loop of the waste yarn. And that's 1 stitch. We're not going to count these 2 stitches that are on the needle that are attached to the slip knot. We don't count those. On the first row, when we begin working with our project yarn, when we begin knitting, we're just going to drop these 2 off the needle. So again, just like a long tail cast on, up through the first strand of the waste yarn, down through that loop on the index finger, bring that project yarn through the loop of the waste yarn that's on the thumb. And you can see the stitches on the needle are the stitches for your project yarn. So this cast on is really easy to do when you don't have a crochet hook. And now I'll just knit a few rows and show you how to remove this provisional cast on. Now that we've knit a few rows, it's time to remove the provisional cast on. and get these live stitches onto the needle. And if you remember with this provisional cast on, I said that I was going to drop those two stitches that are connected to the slip knot. We just drop them off on that first row of knitting with the project yarn. So that's what I did. One way that this provisional cast on differs from the cast-ons done, provisional cast-ons done with the crochet hook, is that we don't have the option to tug on the tail and then unzip the provisional cast-on. So with this particular provisional cast-on, I just use the tip of a knitting needle and just unpick the chain. You just have to find out where it starts and just gently pull the yarn out. It can help if you use scissors and just make a couple snips. You know, let's say if you have a really long cast on, maybe you want to make a couple snips in between some stitches to make the tail shorter, and then it'll be easier and quicker to pull out. But for this example, the tail's not that long. So you just pull the waste yarn out. And you'll see your live stitches hanging out there. And we would just get those onto the needle and begin knitting from there. And of course, we'd keep going to remove the rest of this waste yarn. And there you go. And now we're ready to begin knitting in the opposite direction. This method of provisional cast on requires a crochet hook and your waste yarn. We're going to start with a slip knot. And I just like to hold on to the tail of this waste yarn just to keep it from swinging around too much. But you hold on to the tail of it, and you're just going to take your crochet hook around the yarn and pull it through that loop. Catch the crochet hook and pull it through the loop. Just like that. And every inch or so, when it starts getting a little unwieldy, I just move my fingers up to pinch the chain, this chain of stitches that we're creating. And that's just to stabilize it so it doesn't get all crazy and swing around. And with this kind of provisional cast on, you're going to want to make several chains more than the number of stitches you need. So for example, if the project is calling for 10 stitches to be cast on, you're gonna want to make maybe 15 chains. And with this kind of provisional cast on, let me just cut this off. On the back of this chain, you can see these bumps here. there's a bump for each chain that we made. And the way we pick up our stitches with our project yarn is that we work, leave a couple chains in on the end here. That's why you had to make more chains than you needed stitches. And for each of these bumps, we're going to pick up a stitch of our project yarn. So pull up a stitch through that bump on the back of this chain. And we'll do that again on the next bump behind the chain. Pull our project yarn through. Now I've got 2 stitches on the needle. Just like that. And when you're ready to begin working with your project yarn, so you've casted on your stitches and you just continue, just like normal knitting, continue working with your project yarn. And you just keep knitting. Now we've knit a few rows and it's time to remove the provisional cast on and get some live stitches on our needle and knit in the opposite direction. What's really great about this particular provisional cast on is that the tail end of the provisional cast on acts as a kind of zipper. So if you just pull on it, it'll unravel itself. And you'll end up with live stitches. See here? And you want to get those back onto your needle. Let me just pull this out gently. Grab the other side of the needle and put these stitches onto the needle. And now we can begin knitting in the opposite direction. So maybe, I would have put this on some waste yarn or something to keep it out of the way. But right there, we've just undone the provisional cast on and gotten the live stitches back onto the needle, and we're getting ready to work in this direction. Another method of making a provisional cast on is with a crochet hook and a knitting needle. So let's take our waste yarn and make a slip knot on the crochet hook. I'm going to have the knitting needle in my left hand, and I'm just going to hold this little tail so it doesn't swing around too much. I'm going to lay the crochet hook on top of the knitting needle and bring the working yarn. It's still waste yarn, but it's the working yarn side. And bring it under the knitting needle and catch that hook on the crochet hook and pull that yarn through the loop of my crochet hook. See if we could do that again. I've got the crochet hook on top of the knitting needle. I'm going to bring the yarn under the knitting needle, over the crochet hook, and pull that loop through. And you don't want to hold anything too tightly. And make sure to bring the yarn so that it's on the right side of the crochet hook, right? So you're coming under the knitting needle, over the crochet hook, and pulling it through the loop. Under the knitting needle, over the crochet hook, and pulling it through the loop. You see this chain forming. And then when you're ready to begin working your project, we're going to take this last stitch and put it on the needle. And that's how many stitches you needed for your project. So in other words, when you're doing this type of provisional cast on, you'd want to cast on, as you're working those loops, one less than what your pattern calls for, because that last stitch that's on your crochet hook is going to be put onto the needle, and that gives you your total amount of stitches. From here, we just take our project yarn and begin knitting. I'll knit a few rows and then show you what it looks like when you have to remove this provisional cast on. I've knit a few rows, and now it's time to remove the provisional cast on so that we can get these live stitches onto the needle. We're going to find the tail here where there are two tails. We're just going to use the tip of our other knitting needle and just pick out the waste yarn a few stitches, so that eventually if you pick out one or two stitches, you'll be able to then so we're just going to unpick this yarn, one or two stitches, and then we'll be able to tug on it so that it unzips and leaves all of those live stitches. And on the last one, you might have to be really careful with that one so you don't pull too hard to get that out. There we go. And now we've got live stitches that we just need to put onto the needle. And then you can begin working in the opposite direction.